When Michael found out that Isabella had told her mother, he panicked. He didn't know what to do. He couldn't avoid the truth anymore. But the thought of telling his parents terrified him. How would they react? Would they even believe him? He couldn't imagine the anger, the disappointment, the shame that would follow. The next day, Michael's mother called him into the living room. Her face was serious, and he knew something was wrong. "Michael," she began, her voice low, "Isabella's mother called me today. She said you and Isabella need to talk." Michael felt his heart race. He knew exactly what was coming. "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, his palms sweating. "What did she say?" His mother's eyes softened, but there was a hint of worry in them. "Michael, we know about what happened. Isabella told her mother, and her mother called me." Michael froze. It was all out in the open now. "I didn't mean for this to happen, Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking. "It was a mistake. We didn't know what we were doing. We never meant to hurt anyone." His mother looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and sadness. "How could you, Michael? How could you keep something like this from us?" She paused, her voice trembling. "You're still a child. You don't understand what this means." Tears filled Michael's eyes. He had disappointed her. He had disappointed them all. The weight of his actions crushed him, and for the first time, he truly understood the consequences of what he had done. In the days that followed, the weight of the situation seemed to suffocate Michael and Isabella. Their parents were angry, confused, and hurt. Michael's mother cried for hours, unable to comprehend how her son had gotten involved in something so dangerous. Isabella's mother, though more understanding, was still filled with concern about how this would affect Isabella's future. Both families agreed that something had to be done. Isabella would need to see a doctor to confirm the pregnancy and figure out what their next steps would be. Michael's parents, though upset, promised to help him through this, but the rift between them and their son was evident. There was no going back from this.
"We'll figure this out," Isabella's mother said softly, holding her daughter in her arms. "But this will change everything." Michael sat alone in his room later that night, his mind racing. He had always heard stories about people making mistakes, but he never thought he would be one of them. He had ruined his life, and Isabella's life too. There was no going back to the innocence they had once shared. Days turned into weeks, and the reality of what they had done set in. Michael and Isabella barely spoke. They were both living with the weight of their actions, isolated from the people they once considered family. Their parents didn't know how to treat them anymore. They were no longer the innocent children they once were. At school, things were different too. They had both become the subject of whispered conversations. Students looked at them with pity, and some even avoided them altogether. The guilt weighed heavily on their hearts. They had once been friends, but now they were strangers in their own lives. Days turned into weeks, and for Michael and Isabella, nothing felt normal anymore. The whispers at school never stopped. Everywhere they went, there were looks, sometimes sympathetic, other times judgmental. Both of them had become the subject of conversations they didn't want to be part of, and every time they met, there was a silent acknowledgement of what had happened. They were now forced to navigate a world that felt both foreign and unforgiving. Michael spent most of his time at home, locked away in his room, staring blankly at the wall. He couldn't bring himself to face his parents anymore. Every conversation with them felt strained, as if they were both walking on eggshells around him. His mother would ask him questions, but there was a sadness in her voice now. A sadness that made him feel like he'd let her down in ways he couldn't fix. One evening, as Michael sat at the dinner table, his father cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Michael," he began, his voice firm but quiet, "we need to talk about what happens next." Michael's heart sank. He knew what was coming, but hearing it out loud made it real. He looked up at his father, his mind racing. "I don't know what to say," he whispered.
"We're going to figure this out," his father said, but there was no warmth in his words. "But you need to understand that this is a serious situation. There are consequences to your actions." Michael nodded, but the weight of his father's words felt unbearable. He had ruined everything, and now it seemed there was no way out. He wanted to fix things, but nothing could erase what he had done. Isabella, too, was struggling. She hadn't spoken to Michael in days, but the guilt gnawed at her every waking moment. She lay in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering how things had spiraled so far. It had all started with a simple curiosity, but now here they were facing a future they never thought possible. Her mother had been more understanding than Michael's, but even she couldn't hide the worry in her eyes. They had Je and what everyone else expected of her. One evening, her mother asked her, "Isabella, do you want to keep the baby?" Isabella hesitated, tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't know, Mom. I don't know what to do. I'm not ready for this. But I don't want to disappoint you either." Her mother sighed, pulling her into a tight hug. "You won't disappoint me, darling, but you need to think carefully about what's best for you." Isabella was trying to be supportive, but the weight of the decision pressed down on her chest. There was no right answer. She felt like she was drowning in a sea of choices, each one more overwhelming than the last. As the days went by, the pressure on Michael and Isabella intensified. Their once carefree lives had been replaced by fear, shame, and uncertainty. They were constantly reminded of the consequences of their actions, and the future seemed impossible to face. At school, the atmosphere was different. Students avoided them, whispering behind their backs. Michael couldn't take it anymore. The isolation, the stares, the constant reminder of his mistake, it was too much. One afternoon, as he walked home from school, he felt a wave of panic wash over him. He couldn't go back to his house, couldn't face his parents, not yet. Instead, he found himself walking aimlessly through the streets, hoping that if he just kept moving, he could outrun the storm inside him. Isabella, too, was struggling with her own demons. Her friends had all distanced themselves. No one knew how to talk to her anymore. She found herself sitting alone in the park, staring at the empty swings. Her once vibrant world had become a lonely place, filled with regret and uncertainty. But amidst the loneliness, Isabella found herself questioning everything. Was this the life she was meant to have? Could things ever go back to normal, or had they crossed a line from which there was no return? It was late one evening when Michael's phone buzzed. He hadn't been able to focus on anything for days, but the notification caught his attention. It was from Isabella. "We need to talk." His heart skipped a beat. He hadn't spoken to her in days, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to face her again. But something in the message told him he couldn't ignore her. She was struggling just as much as he was. He grabbed his jacket and headed out the door, making his way to the park where they had met so many times before. When he arrived, Isabella was already there, sitting on the same bench where they had spent so many hours laughing and dreaming. But tonight, her eyes were different, darker, filled with confusion and fear. "Michael," she said softly as he sat beside her. "I don't know what to do anymore. I don't know how to make it right." He looked at her, his heart heavy with the same uncertainty. "I don't know either, Isabella. I wish I could fix it, but I don't know how. I never thought it would get this bad." Isabella sighed, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "I wish I could go back. I wish I could just erase everything." Michael felt the same way, but he knew that was impossible. "We can't go back, Isabella, but maybe we can figure out what to do now. Together." As the weeks turned into months, the reality of their situation began to settle in. Michael and Isabella's lives had changed forever, but somehow they were finding a way to live with the consequences. They attended counseling together, working through their emotions and the guilt they had been carrying. It wasn't easy, but they were learning how to forgive themselves and each other. One evening, as they sat together in the park, watching the sunset, Isabella turned to Michael with a small smile. "Maybe this is just the beginning," she said quietly. "Maybe we don't know what's ahead, but we can face it together." Michael nodded, a sense of peace washing over him. "Yeah, we'll figure it out. We always do." The story of Michael and Isabella had become a lesson, not just for them, but for everyone around them. The consequences of their actions had been far-reaching. But they had learned valuable lessons about responsibility, trust, and the importance of parents staying connected to their children. Though their lives had been forever changed, Michael and Isabella knew they couldn't undo what had happened. But they had choices to move forward, to grow, and to face the challenges ahead, stronger than before. And for the first time in a long while, they felt like maybe, just maybe, There was hope.